Good morning. So as Rob just said, I'm going to talk about the main party's proposals on public service spending. And to give you the very big picture, in a nutshell, the Conservatives haven't announced any large spending policies, whereas Labour, by contrast, have announced significant spending policies. And just to give you the very headline detail on Labour's policies, this has taken the costing straight from their manifesto, and it shows you the composition of the £44 billion of extra public service spending that they think they're going to do. As you can see, the majority of it is going to be on education, large chunks of extra spending on early years education, schools, a bit on further education and particularly universities, and then some additional spending as well on health, social care and a number of other smaller areas. For the purposes of this talk, I will talk about most of the green and yellow areas. In the interest of time, I won't be talking about further education or some of the smaller commitments on public service spending that Labour have announced. So I'll start by talking about the two areas that are kind of cross-cutting across different public service areas. One of those is investment. So Labour announced a National Transformation Fund, which would aim to invest £250 billion over 10 years. And their priority areas that they've talked about are transport, energy, communications, scientific research and housing. They've also announced an additional £2 billion of capital spending for the NHS, which is a bit ambiguous but might come out of this fund as well. Now, if delivered, this would be really quite a big increase in public sector investment. It would keep investment at spending at a level not seen since the 1970s. And I can show you that very quickly with this graph, which is net investment over time. And it's important to note that actually, even under current government plans, investment and spending as a share of national income is forecast to increase over the next Parliament and to reach a level that hasn't really been seen for quite a few decades, if you ignore that little peak from the financial crisis. Now, if Labour were to spend an extra £250 billion a year, that would put investment at over 3% of national income by the end of the Parliament, and it hasn't been sustained at that level for a long time. We can add in some history, but perhaps the state was arguably a different beast back in the 1960s and 70s. So spending at this level hasn't been sustained for a long time. Now, it could well be beneficial. We could boost the supply side capacity of the economy, and it is true that government borrowing costs are at the moment relatively low. But you would need to ensure, the government would need to ensure that each individual investment project did actually offer a genuinely good return. And that's going to be harder to do in the context of investment already reaching high levels by recent standards. Moving rapidly on, public sector pay. The different parties have different proposals here. The Conservatives are broadly sticking to current government policy of capping increases in public sector pay scales to 1% a year up to 2019-20. Labour, on the other hand, have said that they would delegate public sector pay to pay review bodies, and the Liberal Democrats have said that they would increase public sector pay in line with inflation. Now, what does that do for the difference between public and private sector pay? This graph shows you the difference in just the raw average pay in the public and the private sectors. Why does this matter? Well, it really matters for how easy or difficult the public sector finds it to recruit the kinds of workers that it wants and to hold on to those workers once they're in that sector. Now, I don't want you to think too much about the absolute level of this line. Zero is not necessarily the right answer. We would expect workers in the public sector to earn more than those in the private sector on average. They tend to be more qualified, doing more highly skilled occupations. But what you can see is that at the moment we're roughly back at the level we were pre-crisis in terms of the relativity of the two sectors. Now, under the Conservative plans, with a 1% increase each year going forward to 1920, you would see that difference between the two sectors falling quite dramatically and reaching the lowest level that we've seen since at least the last 20 years when we have data. And that's likely to exacerbate the problems in recruitment and retention that are starting to show up in certain parts of the public sector. What about under Labour? Well, if we assume that the pay review bodies increase public sector pay in line with private sector pay, then we'd expect this difference to stay at the current levels going forwards, and the Liberal Democrats' policy would put them somewhere in between. So, whilst the Conservative policy perhaps seems bad from the point of view that it might have adverse consequences on the quality of public sector workers, Labour's policy isn't a free lunch either, and high wage growth is basically costly for public sector service providers or public sector employers. And we estimate that if public sector wages grew in line with private sector wages, then actually public employers would need an additional £9 billion by 1920 in order to pay for that higher wage bill without having to either cut employment or cut spending elsewhere. And obviously each of those would impact on service quality as well. So I'll now move on to talk very briefly about individual areas of public service spending, and for want of a better argument, I'm going to do this in roughly life cycle order. So we're going to start with childcare. Now, Simplifying, the state currently funds childcare in two main ways. There are free hours of care provided for some 3- and 4-year-olds, where providers are paid by the state. And then there are also a bunch of tax subsidies for parents. Now, Labour have proposed quite big policy changes in this area. What they're proposing is essentially a big shift towards universal state provision. So they want to expand these free hours to be 30 hours a week for all 2- to 4-year-olds by the end of the Parliament, and they've announced an ambition to extend that further to provide some free hours for 1-year-olds as well. And they want to raise the reimbursement rate that providers get for providing those hours of care by around 50%, so quite a big increase in the amount of funding that providers are going to get to help upskill the workforce. Furthermore, they want to provide additional subsidies for additional childcare use over those 30 hours. On the other hand, they want to end all these tax subsidies for parents, so shifting very much more into the universal state provision. Now, not only is this a big policy change in structural terms, it also involves a very big increase in the level of state funding as well. Labour's estimated the net cost of this policy at over £5 billion by the end of the Parliament, and that's a substantial increase on the level of spending on early years and child support at the moment. Now, I've told you it's expensive, but it's also the case that the long-run cost of this policy might be considerably higher than Labour have estimated. Aside from those extra ambitions that I talked about that aren't included in the costing, Labour's costing assumes that they end all of the tax subsidies for childcare, but a lot of that support at the moment goes to children who are aged 5 and over, whereas all the additional hours of childcare Labour's talks about providing are for children under 4. So if Labour continues to provide some support for the over 5s, then that's going to increase the cost of their reform. It's also the case that take-up has major implications for the cost of this scheme, but is very uncertain. To give you an idea of magnitude here, around a 10 percentage point greater take-up of 30 hours amongst 2-year-olds would increase the policy cost by around £0.7 billion. So it's really quite important, and we don't think Labour is assuming full take-up, so there's quite a lot of scope for the cost to come in higher than Labour has anticipated. In terms of the impacts on others, obviously it's a big giveaway to families with children aged 2 to 4 who become entitled to this free childcare and to the additional hours above the 30 years. It's potentially a takeaway from older children if Labour doesn't introduce other policies for children aged 5 and over. There are potential gains for child development and maternal labour supply, which are the normal arguments put forward for state funding of childcare, although it's very hard to predict those with any degree of certainty. And in terms of providers, they are benefiting from a much higher level of funding, enabling them to employ higher quality workers. But it's worth noting that channeling all this funding through the supply side might give the government more influence over providers. And in particular, the design of the subsidy scheme for additional hours is going to be crucial here. Now, after childcare comes schools. So this graph shows you real English school spending per pupil under current government plans. The government's embarking on the first real terms cut to school spending since the mid-1990s. Under current plans, spending per pupil is forecast to fall by 6.5% between 2015-16 and 2019-20, which is the last year for which the spending review set spending plans by department. Now, what the Conservatives said, well, they've said they'll increase overall school budget by £4 billion by 21-22. We think that's a £4 billion nominal increase over current spending levels. And that will put them roughly at this blue cross here. And that looks like a continuation of the trajectory under current plans. It would imply a 7% essentially fall in real per pupil spending over this period. What about Labour? Well, in marked contrast, they've said that they would reverse the cuts and protect per pupil funding in real terms. Figures suggest a 1.6% real increase per pupil spending over the same period. And the Liberal Democrats, again, somewhere in the middle, protecting per pupil funding in real terms at current levels. It's worth noting these are all figures for overall school spending, and individual schools can face a range of outcomes, and further details of that are in an observation that was published this morning. Very related to schools, free school meals. School lunch is currently free for disadvantaged pupils and all children in the first 3 years of primary school. And interestingly, the main parties have completely opposite proposals here. So Labour would extend free school lunches to all primary pupils, costing nearly £1 billion, whereas the Conservatives would restrict free school lunches back to disadvantaged pupils, but instead provide free breakfasts for all primary pupils. Which of these is better value for money? Well, there is some evidence that universal school universal free school meals, might raise, school lunches, we have to be specific now, might raise attainment, although it's unclear exactly which mechanisms that works through, because the mechanisms you'd think there's less evidence of those specifically working. IFS research has also found that a one-year breakfast programme in disadvantaged schools delivered similar academic benefits to free school lunches. And we can tell that actually that came through improved behaviour, improved concentration and reduced absences. Now, it's certainly the case that there are uncertain gains from rolling either policy nationally. Most of these results tend to come from experiments done in relatively disadvantaged schools, so it's unclear how much of that would extend if you did it across the whole country. But free school breakfasts are considerably cheaper, so given the evidence, it looks like they would be better value for money. Right, after schools come higher education. This is Labour's single biggest policy proposal in their manifesto. They would end university tuition fees, replacing it with public funding for universities, and they would bring back maintenance grants for poorer students. Now, as you'd expect, this is very expensive. For the government, Labour estimate that it would add £11 billion to borrowing in 21-22, and we think that's likely a slight underestimate. We estimate around £13 billion. But it's important to note the long-run cost of this would be slightly lower, because under the current system, a majority of loans would have been written off. Partially written off, sorry, not completely written off. The impact of this on students, obviously it reduces the cost of going to university. Perhaps counterintuitively, though, it's the higher earning graduates who gain more than lower earning graduates, and that's because under the current system, where loan repayments are linked to earnings, it's those higher earning graduates that would have paid off more of their loans during their working life. And so when you replace those loans with grants, it's those higher earning graduates that don't repay that anymore, and therefore that gain more. Perhaps less obviously, we think that Labour's costing implies a cap on student numbers at the current level. That's not to say this is necessarily what they intend, but it does imply that if they wanted to increase student numbers from the current level, the cost of the policy would be greater than their costing suggests. In terms of the impact on institutions, well, there is the risk that budgetary pressure on the public finances in future could reduce university funding. And actually, we think that the Labour costing already assumes that these new tuition fee grants, if you like, are kept constant in nominal terms going forwards, whereas actually fees were expected to rise in line with RPIX inflation. And that means that universities are going to have around 30% less funding per year per student by 21-22 than they would under current plans. Now, if you did want to increase grants in line with RPIX inflation, again, the cost of the policy would be associatedly higher. But it's not clear that fee increase in line or university income increase in line with RPIX inflation was necessarily the right answer in any case. Also, for better or worse, it's likely that the government could target funding of particular subjects or particular institutions more easily under a grant-based system than under a fee system. Right, health, always a popular election battleground. This graph shows real English Department of Health spending. Under current plans, that is expected to increase by £4 billion from last year to 2020-21, which again is the last year that the spending review had set spending plans for. That would be an average 0.8% a year increase in spending. What the Conservatives said, well, they have said that they would increase NHS spending by a minimum of £8 billion in real terms over the next 5 years. That would put them at the Blue Cross. We don't know how they would intend to get there. If you assume they did it linearly, the line would look like this. So you can see again, it looks very similar to a continuation of current government policy. What about Labour? Well, they said they would increase spending on health by £8.4 billion in 2021-22 relative to current plans. Here I'm wrapping together extra spending on current spending, extra capital spending, the extra money that Labour have said they would give to the NHS in light of public sector pay increasing, and also the additional money set aside for nurses' bursaries. Now, a slight complication with interpreting this pledge is that, of course, we don't actually have current plans for 21-22. So if we compare to a year earlier, Labour's plans imply nearly a 10% increase between last year and 2020-21. That'd be an average 2.3% a year increase over that period. So as you can see, it's quite hard to compare their plans completely for any given year, but you can get the idea that Labour are suggesting spending around £5 billion more on the NHS than the Conservatives. Now, I don't think I said when I was talking about public sector pay, although it was on the slide if any of you noticed it, that we estimate that actually the NHS might need an extra £2.9 billion to cover the potentially greater pay in the NHS under Labour's proposals to delegate public sector pay setting to the pay review bodies. So a large chunk of this difference between Labour and the Conservatives might already be allocated, if you like, to pay for higher wages in the health sector. Now, it's not to suggest that money doesn't count, obviously it does, but it's already allocating some of that potential service improvement to come from higher wages. What about the Liberal Democrats? Again, somewhere in between. Now, to put all these figures in context, you would need an average 0.7% a year increase in spending in order to keep pace with population growth. So under current government plans, you're getting roughly constant per capita spending. You'd need around 1.2% a year growth to keep pace with age-adjusted population growth, so take account not just of the increasing size, but also the ageing of the population and the fact that older people tend to require more and more expensive healthcare. So under the Conservative plans, their spending would be roughly constant per age-adjusted person. But it's worth noting that whether you get the Conservatives' 1% a year increase or Labour's 2% a year increase, both of those increases in spending are considerably lower than historical average. So UK health spending has grown by around 40% a year on average over the last 60 years or so. To illustrate that, this is exactly the same graph I showed you before, but if spending had increased by 4% a year since 2009-10, health spending would be up by this green line. So in that context, you can see that both parties are actually proposing relatively modest increases in health spending compared to history. Now, that's not necessarily a plug for more money for the NHS. I mean, it is going to find it difficult if costs and expectations continue to rise, but it's important not to lose sight of the long-run context as well and the implications of current spending levels. So the OBR has projected that increasing health spending could need to rise by over 5% of national income over the next 50 years as a result of demographic and other cost pressures. And funding that would require either considerably higher taxes or considerable cuts elsewhere, or a combination of both, and the future governments are likely to find that difficult. So alternatively, it might be time to start thinking seriously about sustainable ways to reduce the growth of health spending. So quite how difficult the NHS finds another parliament of relatively low spending increases depends crucially on the expectations that are being placed on the health system going forwards. Finally, social care, simplifying massively. There are two main problems with social care in England. One is the biggest one perhaps is the lack of available insurance. This is a hugely expensive thing, and you do not know whether you are going to incur these costs later in life or not. Now, in any other circumstances where you can think of a situation like that, there's insurance that you can buy to provide for those costs in the event that they happen. That's not the case with social care. So that's a big problem in this market. Also, the level of funding available to those entitled to state support at the moment arguably isn't enough for the care that they're looking for. Much more acute, much more proximate problem. Now, the Care Act was due to introduce a cap on private contributions to lifetime costs originally in 2016. It got kicked to 2020. That would increase certainty for individuals about the total amount of costs that they might have to pay over their lifetime, and it might have increased the availability of insurance to cover that capped level of cost. In terms of the party proposals, well, I think the Conservatives we can agree are a bit unclear as to what their policy actually is. Their manifesto seemed to U-turn on the Care Act and not propose implementing a cap on private contributions. Theresa May has then perhaps U-turned on their manifesto, and now the Conservatives look like they would be introducing a cap, although we don't know at what level. What they have said they would do is change the asset means test, for which they didn't provide a costing, and the exact losers or potential winners from this depend very much on your level of assets, your income, your needs, and the care package. And there aren't enough details spelled out in the manifestos to enable a proper comparison of this. Labour have been at least much more stable in what their ambition is. They have an ambition for a national care service, which sounds very similar qualitatively to the Care Act, although there aren't precise details. But we do know they want a cap on private contributions to care costs, and they're also planning to increase the asset threshold. This would require additional funding that hasn't been set out yet. What Labour have done and the Conservatives haven't done is that they've provided additional funding under the current system of an extra £2 billion by the end of the Parliament to be spent on social care. although it's worth noting that 40% of that is taken up by the likely cost rise from Labour's higher minimum wage than under the Conservative policy. Again, not to suggest that that money isn't being used, it's just that it's already going to be allocated to increasing wages rather than, say, expanding service provision. So that's the end of my whistle-stop tour. Big summary, Conservatives haven't announced large spending policies. Labour have. There's a big move towards universal state provision of education at all ages. There's significant additional spending on investment in childcare and schools, but it's worth noting that several policies could turn out more costly than Labour have estimated. I'll now hand over to Carl to talk about the implications of all of this for borrowing and debt.